After years of the most comprehensive sanctions regime ever imposed on a nation, sanctions that collapsed, Iran's currency slashed oil exports to a fraction of previous levels and severed its banking system from global finance. Tehran just signed a Memorandum of Understanding that deepens its integration with major powers and regional states. The contradiction is stark. Maximum pressure was designed to achieve exactly the opposite: force Iran into capitulation, prevent strategic partnerships, and bring the regime to its knees. Instead, the MoU represents Iran's emergence from isolation on terms it chose, not ones dictated by Washington. This is a geopolitical failure hiding in plain sight. Most analysis fixates on Iran's economic suffering, the inflation, the shortages, the measurable pain. But economic damage was never the actual scorecard. The real test was whether pressure would prevent precisely what just happened. By that measure, the strategy didn't just fail, it backfired. The question isn't whether sanctions hurt Iran. They clearly did. The question is how a policy that inflicted such massive economic damage failed so completely in achieving its political objectives. The answer reveals fundamental miscalculations about how power competition actually functions in a multipolar world. Miscalculations that continue shaping American strategy today. The MoU formalized what had been developing quietly for years. Comprehensive strategic coordination spanning security coordination, economic integration, technology transfer, and diplomatic alignment. While specific provisions vary depending on the particular agreement, whether with China under their 25-year strategic partnership framework, expanded coordination with Russia, or deepened ties with regional actors, the pattern is consistent. Iran is embedding itself within alternative networks that operate outside Western-dominated institutions. The timeline tells the story. Serious negotiations accelerated not despite maximum pressure, but because of it. As sanctions tightened between 2018 and 2020, Tehran intensified diplomatic outreach eastward. What began as economic necessity evolved into strategic choice. By 2021, with hardliners consolidated in power domestically, Iran moved from tactical cooperation with China and Russia toward formalized, long-term commitments. What distinguishes this moment from previous arrangements is scope and durability. Earlier agreements were transactional oil for goods, limited defense cooperation. These new frameworks envision decades-long partnerships covering infrastructure investment, military coordination, intelligence sharing, and explicit political alignment on international issues. The context matters. This unfolds while nuclear negotiations remain stalled. U.S.-Iran tensions simmer without resolution, and the international system fragments into competing blocs. The technical details matter less than what they represent. A formalized rejection of the Western-centric order that maximum pressure was designed to enforce. Historical background. In May 2018, the United States withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the multilateral nuclear agreement that had constrained Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. What followed was maximum pressure, the most comprehensive sanctions campaign ever directed at a major regional power. The strategy had explicit objectives. Force Iran back to negotiations for a more restrictive deal, covering not just nuclear activities, but ballistic missiles and regional behavior. Curtail Tehran's influence across the Middle East. Compel regime behavior change, or in the more ambitious version, catalyze regime change itself. The sanctions architecture was unprecedented. Secondary sanctions threatened any entity regardless of nationality conducting business with Iran. Oil exports, which sustained Iran's economy at over 2 million barrels daily, were targeted for elimination. Iran's banking system was severed from international finance. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was designated a terrorist organization, criminalizing interaction with vast sections of Iran's economy. The economic impact was devastating. Iran's currency lost 2/3 of its value. GDP contracted sharply. Oil exports plummeted to a few 100,000 barrels daily, often smuggled and sold at discounts. The underlying assumptions seemed straightforward. Economic pain would translate directly into political concessions because Iran had no viable alternatives. The architects cited historical precedents. Libya's capitulation under pressure seemed the relevant model. The Biden administration maintained most sanctions despite rhetorical shifts toward diplomacy, ensuring policy continuity. But the architects had studied the wrong lessons. They examined Libya's surrender while missing the critical variable that made Iran's response entirely different. The critical miscalculation was temporal. Maximum pressure assumed Iran had no alternatives to Western economic integration, an assumption already outdated when the strategy launched in 2018. The world had changed. China needed reliable energy supplies outside American interdiction range and saw Iran as a Belt and Road corridor connecting East and West Asia. Russia, increasingly estranged from Europe, found common cause with another sanctioned state facing Western pressure. Regional powers recalibrated as American commitment to the Middle East visibly declined. Iran didn't simply endure sanctions, it adapted. The 25-year strategic partnership with China formalized what economics had already created: deep energy interdependence. Cooperation with Russia expanded from arms sales to intelligence sharing, joint military exercises, and coordinated positions on Syria. Meanwhile, Iran, Russia, China, and others climbed the sanctions learning curve together, developing alternative payment systems. Sophisticated oil smuggling networks using ship-to-ship transfers and transponders switched off, webs of front companies and cryptocurrency channels that bypassed dollar-denominated finance. The diplomatic dimension compounded the problem. Unilateral U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA fractured transatlantic unity. European allies attempted mechanisms like Instex to preserve the deal, undermining the pressure campaign's coherence. Internally, sanctions didn't empower Iranian moderates who favored engagement. They discredited them. Hardliners arguing for self-reliance and Eastern orientation were vindicated. Here's what changed everything. Maximum pressure was designed for a unipolar world, but implemented in an increasingly multipolar one. That timing mismatch guaranteed failure. Isolation didn't produce capitulation. It produced exactly the strategic partnerships Washington most feared. Regionally, Iran emerges strengthened relative to Gulf Arab states that bet on maximum pressure succeeding. The Abraham Accords normalization process now faces complications Israel and Arab states must reckon with, and Iran, less isolated than anticipated, still influential across proxy networks in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, and now backed by great power partnerships that complicate military options. The American security architecture built on Gulf alliances and Israeli cooperation confronts a peer competitor with substantially more strategic depth. Globally, the implications extend further. Maximum pressure demonstrated the declining effectiveness of unilateral American sanctions when targeted states have alternatives. A sanctions-resistant bloc is emerging, states that trade among themselves using non-dollar mechanisms, share evasion techniques, and provide each other political cover. De-dollarization efforts, once theoretical, accelerate as nations observe Iran's survival and adaptation. Energy markets reconfigure quietly. China secures long-term supplies outside potential interdiction. Iran reintegrates into regional energy flows through alternative channels. Russia and Iran coordinate as major producers operating partially outside Western-dominated pricing structures. The winners are clear. China gains a strategic partner along critical geography. Russia, an aligned state sharing threat perceptions. Iran breaks isolation on acceptable terms. Losers include European states watching influence decline and regional actors forced to recalibrate. American credibility suffers most acutely. The precedent reverberates. Venezuela, North Korea, Syria, all observe that endurance and alternative partnerships can outlast pressure. Future multilateral agreements face a fundamental credibility problem when Washington appears an unreliable partner. The real cost isn't measured in Iranian economic damage. It's measured in eroded American policy tools and validation of an alternative path others are already following. Washington confronts options with no clear winners. Escalating pressure remains possible, targeting Chinese and Russian entities trading with Iran, more aggressively tightening enforcement, potentially interdicting shipments. But risks are substantial. Further alienating allies already skeptical of unilateral approaches, accelerating anti-Western bloc formation, and gaining limited additional leverage, given how comprehensive existing sanctions already are. Military escalation becomes likelier if pressure includes physical interdiction. Domestic politics may favor this path despite strategic downsides. Diplomatic reset offers another route, rejoining a modified JCPOA or negotiating fresh frameworks addressing regional concerns. Challenges multiply here. Iranian hardliners now govern from a strengthened position with reduced incentive to compromise. Domestic American politics constrain flexibility. Israel and Gulf states demand tougher terms than Iran would accept. Credibility questions linger after the previous withdrawal. Nuclear escalation could force this option despite current resistance. Tacit acceptance presents a third path: maintain sanctions nominally while reducing enforcement, effectively accepting Iran's regional position while managing specific proliferation risks. This allows face saving for both sides and could stabilize tensions, but leaves fundamental issues unresolved and risks appearing weak domestically. A broader regional security architecture analogous to Cold War frameworks remains theoretically possible but practically distant, given entrenched hostilities and competing visions of regional order. Wildcards complicate every scenario. Israeli military action, Iranian nuclear breakout, major regional conflict, administration changes, economic crisis despite partnerships. Washington faces a strategic dilemma with no good options, only choices between different kinds of setbacks. The question is, which type of failure proves most tolerable? The contradiction we opened with resolves into clarity. Maximum pressure inflicted undeniable economic damage, but failed completely in its strategic objectives. The MoU proves that pain and leverage are not synonymous, especially when targeted states have alternatives, and the international system offers alternative partnerships willing to provide them. This failure reveals something deeper than policy miscalculation. American tools designed for a unipolar moment increasingly malfunction in multipolar competition, where other powers offer viable alternatives to Western integration. The question was never whether Iran suffered under sanctions. It clearly did. The question is whether that suffering accomplished anything strategically valuable. By that measure, maximum pressure didn't just fail, it accelerated the very outcomes it sought to prevent, pushing Iran toward precisely the Eastern partnerships and sanctions-resistant mechanisms that now constrain American options. The lesson extends beyond Iran. Coercion requires the target to have no alternatives. When alternatives exist and other powers provide them, pressure alone produces adaptation rather than capitulation. As Washington confronts competitors from China to Russia to regional powers, the fundamental question emerges. Can American strategy adapt beyond pressure-only approaches, or will it continue applying unipolar tools to a multipolar reality until those tools become entirely ineffective? The Iran MoU is less about Iran specifically, and more about whether American statecraft can evolve to match the world as it exists, rather than as it was. The answer will shape not just Middle East policy, but the entire architecture of American power in the decades ahead.